preferred to have been at least two strong men in one, and to have done all the work with my own hands. I love it all. I love to dig. I love to kneel on the grass edge of a flower bed and pull the weeds out fiercely and throw them into a heap. Ooh, there are places here too shady for anything but ferns. I remember a softly rainy spring in Kent, when I spent nearly 3 weeks kneeling on a small rubber mat on the grass edge of a heavenly old herbaceous border bed. Day after day, I knelt on the mat and tucked my plants into the rich, dark, mellow English earth. There. Is this the party? Is this really the party? Oh! Everybody dances. One does it all one's life. Everybody dances. Everybody hears the music. Everybody sometimes wears a necklace and a sash and watches other white frocks whirling by. But was there anyone who really went to the party? Come. It was the lock of the door, which had been closed 10 years, and she put her hand in her pocket, drew out the key, and found it fitted the keyhole. She put the key in and turned it. It took 2 hands to do it, but it did turn. And then she took a long breath and looked up behind her the long walk to see if anyone was coming. No one was coming. No one ever did come, it seemed. And she took a long breath because she could not help it. And she held back the swinging curtain of ivy and pushed back the door, which opened slowly, slowly. Then she slipped through it and shut it behind her and stood with her back against it, looking about her and breathing quite fast with excitement and wonder and delight. She was standing inside the secret garden. My life's work, cheering up gloomy beggars. 52 books, not one turned down by a publisher. My success, the fact I'm interested in everything from emperors, prime ministers, swineherds, cats and dogs, and every smallest blade of grass that grows. In answer to the doubts as to whether I am an American or an English woman, I can only say I do not wonder such doubts exist. The truth is, however, I was born in England. All my people were English, but I have been the mother of 2 American sons. So perhaps by my own birth I am an English woman, but by the birth of my 2 boys, I am an American, born in Manchester! Manchester, it always seemed to be raining on stones, pavements and slate roofs shining with wet. And I saw daisies and buttercups in the public park, always slightly soiled with the soft drift of smut. Oh, soft drift of smut. I like that. Must remember it. Soft drift of smut. Shh! Listen. There's a row in Islington Street. There's a man beating up his wife in Back Sydney Street. There was no need to pretend. There were real stories. But in those old days, I learned the value of love, faithfulness, and unselfishness. And my own extended experience has taught me to value them still more highly. Moreover, it has taught me happiness comes from within, not from without. That lass O'Lowry's. Having gone out one evening after dinner to gather flowers for the house, a niece, standing before a high lilac bush and pulling its pale purple tassels, became suddenly conscious that someone was watching her. Someone standing upon the roadside behind the holly hedge. She did not know that as she stopped here and there to fill her basket, she had been singing to herself in a low tone. Her voice had attracted the passer-by. This passer-by, a tall pit girl with a handsome, resolute face, stood behind the dark green hedge and watched her. Perhaps to this girl, weary with her day's labour, grimed with coal dust, it was not unlike standing outside paradise. Early in the year as it was, there were flowers enough in the beds and among the shrubs to make the spring air fresh with a faint, sweet odour. But here too was a niece in her soft white merino dress, with her basket of flowers, with the blue bells at her belt, and her half-audible song. She struck Joan Lowry with a new sense of beauty and purity. As she watched her, she grew discontented, restless, sore at heart. She could not have told why, but she felt a certain anger against herself. She'd had a hard day. Things had gone wrong at the pit's mouth. Things had gone wrong at home. Her path was never smooth, but today it had been at its roughest. The little song fell upon her ear with a strong pathos. "She's inside on the edge," she said to herself in a dull voice. "I'm outside. There's a difference. It almost looks like the flowers were all round and she's been born among the flowers and there's no way out for her, no more than there's a way in for me." When we went out to Tennessee, everyone said goodbye to me as if for life, as if taking leave of us forever, convinced they'd never see us again. And it looked just as serious to us as it did to them. There were awful, starving days without food, clothes, or fire. But you know, there's times when I'd be glad to go back to those old days of their hardness and uncertainty. There's a wide, wide distance, which is more than a matter of mere space, between a great, murky manufacturing town in England and the mountains and forests of Tennessee. Forests that seemed endlessly deep, mountains covered with their depth of greenness, their pines and laurels swaying and blooming, vines of wild grape and scarlet trumpet flowers swaying and blooming among them, tangled with the branches of sumac and sassafras. On a life founded or formed upon books, one naturally looks back with affection to the first book one possessed. The Little Flower Book. A is for apple, B is for blossom, C for carnation, and R is for rose. I wonder, How many or how few of those who have written books the world knows well were educated for literature? I was not. I lived among the educated, but no literary people till I was taken to America. Miss Carruthers' engagement. Oh, suppose it's only about $1. I'm sure it's worth more, but they might be very stingy. They wrote to me. Your story, Miss Carruthers' engagement, is so distinctly English that our reader's not sure of it having been written by an American. We see that the name given us is not that of the writer. Will you kindly inform us if the story is original? The story is original. I'm English myself and have only been a short time in America. Before we decide, will you send us another story? I did. They wrote back. We have decided to accept your 2 stories and enclose payment. $15 for Hearts and Diamonds and $20 for Miss Carruthers' engagement. We shall be glad to hear from you again. America. I wrote 5 or 6 little $10 or $12 stories a month. You see, I'd fallen into the dreadful habit of looking at everything in the light of material. Mr. Charles Peterson, owner and editor of Peterson's Ladies magazine, told me, "Your work is worth more than any of our other contributors, and that being the case, it's only fair we should pay you more." It all began so early. I can form no idea at all of what life would be like without it. And if, by any human possibility, it should ever come about that I should lose this, I'm quite sure I should not want to go on living. Anyone who has been at school with a teller of stories knows what the wonder means, how he or she is followed about and besought in a whisper to relate romances, how groups gather round and hang on the outskirts of the favoured party in the hope of being able to join it and listen. Not only tell stories, she adored telling them. When she sat or stood in the midst of a circle and began to invent wonderful things, her green eyes grew big and shining, and her cheeks flushed, and without knowing she was doing it, she began to act, and made what she told lovely or alarming by the raising or dropping of her voice, the bend and sway of her slim body, and the dramatic movement of her hands. She forgot she was talking to listening children. She saw and lived with the fairy folk, or the kings and queens and beautiful ladies whose adventures she was narrating. Sometimes, when she'd finished her story, she was quite out of breath with excitement, and would lay her hand on her thin, quick, little rising chest, and half laugh as if at herself. "When I am telling it," she would say, "it doesn't seem as if it was only made up. It seems more real than you are, more real than the schoolroom. I feel as if I were all the people in the story, one after the other. It is queer." thing, slaving over it and writing over it again and again and over and again and again and cutting into it and slashing and... I'm a kind of pen-driving machine, warranted not to wear out. That is all. Write, write, write. Be sick, be tired, be weary and out of ideas if you choose, but write. Oh, my life has been a heavy burden to me. What is it to force this poor little busy brain in this useless, weary, threadbare life? I can't eat my own heart forever. How can I write anything that is worth reading if I never see anything that's worth seeing or speak to people who are worth hearing? How can I weave silk when all I see is calico? Calico. Calico, 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 calico. She was very clever with her fingers and often did excellent things with a bit of chiffon or a wing, or a few yards of linen or muslin and a remnant of lace picked up at a sale. She and Jane spent many a happy afternoon in careful united contemplation of the resources of a limited wardrobe. They found the brown skirt could be altered, and with the addition of new revers and collar and a jabot of string-coloured lace at the neck, would look quite fresh. A black net evening dress, which a patron had good-naturedly given her the year before, could be remodelled and touched up delightfully. Her fresh face and her square white shoulders were particularly adorned by black. There was a white dress which could be sent to the cleaners, and an old pink one whose superfluous breadths could be combined with lace and achieve wonders. I've never had a husband. God knows. I've only had shackled to me two creatures who were indescribable in words. Dr. Swan Burnett and Dr. Stephen Townsend. To be a man's wife and the mother of human beings is a stately thing. Frequently it is not, but it should be. Dr. Swan Burnett said he would wait no longer, and this in the face of all my prayers, tears, and agonized appeals. He has never assumed a man's responsibility in his life. Well, something has to be done to raise us a little from the dust. Respectability does not just mean food and a house. It means graceful, pretty things. A front street, not close to the gasworks, an occasional new book, a piano. He has never had money for anything but his own self-indulgence. And it's not easy for me to forget everything I have done, he has actually claimed credit for. I wonder if it ever occurs to anybody that I should be tired. I don't think it does. Even the faintest manner. How did you get on this morning? Is your story nearly finished yet? How much longer will it take you? But the one perfect thing in my life was the childhood of my two boys. I appeared this, or I appeared that, but all I ever really was the mother of two little boys. They had to be happy. Their lives had to be as bright as I could make them, as far as lives are perfect. Lionel and Vivian were little, I used to pretend to them that I was a fairy. And when their toys were lost, I found them. And when they were broken, I mended them by pretend magic. And when they were hurt, I gave them little fairy kisses to make them well. And they would laugh and say, "Little fairy mama can do anything. All mamas are fairies." And so, when I had to go away from them to write something, they used to say, "She has gone to fairyland." Oh, Vivian, Vivian and Lionel. Now, Lionel, he was the biggest, roughest, tearingest rascal the family had ever known, but he looked as if he'd stepped out of some beautiful picture. Imagine just having to sit there and hear people say, "Oh, that beautiful boy. Who is that beautiful boy?" And being restrained from a sense of decency, from springing up and responding wildly, "He's mine, he's mine, my own." I don't give an atom what people say about me, but my vanity about those two boys is something simply disgusting. Vivian was such a patriotic young American. "When a person is a duke," he said to me once, "what makes him one? What has he done?" Well, it was only a thread of fancy. But one day I had an idea. I will write a story. Now, how can I bring a small young American boy into a close relationship with an English nobleman? Conservative, irascible, disagreeable. Son of younger son, separated from ill-tempered noble father because he is going to marry a poor young American beauty. Young father dead, boy comes into title. Yes. There it is. And Vivian shall be he. Little Lord what? And a day later, it was little Lord Fauntleroy. And then the Earl looked up. What Cedric saw was a large old man with shaggy white hair and eyebrows, and a nose like an eagle's beak between his fierce, deep eyes. What the Earl saw was a graceful, childish figure in a black velvet suit with a lace collar and with love locks waving about the handsome, manly little face, whose eyes met his with a look of innocent good fellowship. If the castle was like a palace in the fairy story, it must be owned that little Lord Fauntleroy was himself rather like a small copy of the fairy prince, although he was not at all aware of the fact, and perhaps was rather a sturdy young model of a fairy. How delightful it was to read the manuscript to him and his brother. He goes very quickly. Already he has filled 100 pages of manuscript, and he has still many more things to do. I should not be surprised if he was very popular. Beautiful boy. Who is that beautiful boy? Lionel, who the gods loved. He was ill 9 months, but I never allowed him to know he had consumption or that he was in danger. And when he died, He passed so softly. I shall never get over. He always wanted me to be near to him. But during those last weeks, it seemed as if he could not bear to be away from me, but I had to spend so much money. I was anxious to write something. His last words to me were, "God bless Mummy." I have to tell it briefly. They have never gone away from you. Those that love you every hour of their lives, they're close to you. They are guards around you. And fields of flowers, she said, forgetting herself as usual when she began, and talking rather as if she were in a dream. Fields and fields of lilies. And when the soft wind blows over them, it wafts the scent of them into the air. And everyone always breathes it, because the soft wind is always blowing. And little children run about in the lily fields and gather armsful of them and laugh and make little wreaths. And the streets are shining, and no one's ever tired. No matter how far they walk, they can float anywhere they like. And there are walls made of pearl and gold all around the city, but they're low enough for people to go and lean on them and look down to the earth and smile and send beautiful messages. Maytham Hall, a charming place with a nicely timbered park, beautiful old walled kitchen garden, square panelled hall, library, billiards room, smoking room, drawing room, dining rooms, 17 or 18 bedrooms, stables, 2 entrance lodges to the park, and a square tower on the roof from which one can see the English Channel. It would have been perfect, except for one incomprehensible, weirdly evil thing. I could never understand it. No one understood it. It did not understand itself. Why in heavens should I, free, able to support myself with an enviable position, surrounded by friends, holding as my most fixed creed that not to be married was paradise, why should I marry any man, but of all men, Dr. Stephen Townsend? Penniless, horrible in temper, and more impudently tenacious and exacting than any creature ever. I never saw a human being with a more self-tormenting, nervous temperament, scarcely sane half the time. You see, he was the only man with an Englishman's temper that I ever knew. Let me tell you something. If a man is sufficiently indecent and unscrupulous, he will rave before your butler and make scenes with your maid. And if you are a woman who has a horror of publicity, such a man can gradually attain almost anything in view. He talked about my duties as a wife, as if I'd married him of my own accord, as if I'd not been forced and blackguarded and blackmailed into it. My duty was to give my property over to him, to live alone at Maytham and provide money enough to keep his chambers and spend as much time there as he liked. I had married him because I loved him and believed he loved me, what Hades I should have passed through. But I have to remember, he was nothing but perfect to Lionel, and he was his comfort and strength and beloved till the last minute. I have never had a husband, God knows. When Stephen left, the black, poisonous clouds had been blown away, and Maytham gave me the atmosphere I like and feel at home in. I talked with my darling Bolton about the rose garden and the 800 tulip and hyacinth, iris and crocus, snowdrop and anemone bulbs which had just arrived, and discussed the 800 which were to arrive in a day or so more. We planned where we would plant more roses. Mary was an odd, determined little person, and now she had something interesting to be determined about. She was very much absorbed indeed. She worked and dug and pulled up weeds steadily, only becoming more pleased with her work every hour instead of tiring of it. It seemed to her like a fascinating sort of play. She found many more of the sprouting pale green points than she had ever hoped to find. They seemed to be starting up everywhere, and each day she was sure she found tiny new ones, some so tiny they barely peeped above the earth. There were so many that she remembered what Martha had said about the snowdrops by the thousands, and about bulbs spreading and making new ones. These had been left to themselves for 10 years, and perhaps they had spread, like snowdrops, into thousands. She wondered how long it would be before they showed that they were flowers. Sometimes she stopped digging to look at the garden and tried to imagine what it would be like when it was covered with thousands of lovely things in bloom. At Maytham, with Mrs. Percival Smith, I visited cottages, taking bundles of baby clothes, little frocks, petticoats, found out names and all the rest. Oh, it was so nice. I gave money and ordered beef for them. This poor old dear could only gibber and cry out at me, but I think I cheered her up a little, for she clung hold to my hand with her cold, bony claw and gibbered out, "Oh, come again, come again." At the Bull Inn, the entertainment was to sing songs with choruses. Oh, Johnny Hook, he's nearly 100 years old, and each year he sings the mistletoe bough. Oh, the mistletoe bough, oh, the mistletoe bough. I just sang as loud as ever I could. It was lovely. Oh, I gave a grand party for the little children, and I was a little Bo Peep. My dress was rose-coloured silk, and it had flowers, satin lace, and bows on it. We danced round in rings and sang songs. We had the most lovely tea, oh, cake, jam puffs, and sweets. I took the party to the fairy wood and the fairy tree and told the story of the Christmas cuckoo. We had races. I've never enjoyed any afternoon as much in my life. Woo! Ooh. When I wrote this, I found it to be an inspiration. I've never written anything better and more subtle. It's called The Making of a Marchioness, and it's a picture of a nice, simple, sweet, prosaic soul who arrives at a good fortune. Its heroine is a sort of Cinderella, a solid, unselfish, kind creature with big feet instead of little ones. Her name is Emily Fox Sexton, and I absolutely adore her, as you will. As the villagers gathered in the park, the house party joined them by way of the gardens. At 2 o'clock, a procession of village children and their friends and parents, headed by the village band, marched up the avenue and passed before the house on their way to the special part of the park. Lady Maria and her guests stood upon the broad steps and welcomed the happy party as it moved by. A conjurer from London gave an entertainment under a huge tree, and children found white rabbits taken from their pockets and oranges from their caps, with squeals of joy and shouts of laughter. The great affair of tea followed the performance. No treat is fairly underway till the children are filled to the brim with tea and buns and cake, principally cake, in plummy wedges. Emily Fox Sexton handed cake and regulated supplies with cheerful tact and good spirits. The children came to her because she knew where toys were kept and what prizes were to be given for the races. She represented law and order and bestowal. She was not so grandly dressed as the others. Her dress was only blue linen with white bands on it, and she had only a sailor hat with a buckle and a bow. But she was of her ladyship's world of London people nevertheless, and they liked her more than they'd ever liked a lady before. Lord Walderhurst stepped forward with his non-committal air and his eyeglass glaring calmly in his eye. The national anthem was sung loudly. Boys and girls, he said, in a far-reaching, clear voice, I want you to give 3 of the biggest cheers you can for the lady who has worked to make your afternoon the success it has been. 3 cheers for Miss Fox Sexton. Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray. It was London that meant living in England to me, really. Because once there, one is so aware, wholly aware of England in London. Ah, the smoke, the busy air of things, the guards shutting and opening with a bang the railway carriage doors. The London smell, which combines asphalt and dust, dampened by water carts and smoke, seemed to constitute a kind of welcome and a congratulation on a voyage past and done with. Now, I love London, especially when I'm fresh from New York, that great, splendid paved space with its stone balustrades, benches for tramps, fountains, statues, Nelson's column with Lord Nelson, and the lions. Ah, great London. I refuse to let myself be homesick for England. But in a locked-out cupboard of my mind, I beat my breast and slowly tear pieces of my hair out. England, my soul requires. to be a tremendous amount of natural, splendid happiness in the lives of every human being. It is the most wondrous thing in life to be a giver. I found my poor cousins of the unfortunate family to be needing my attention very much. When I look at their poor little shabby clothes and their poor little shabby houses and see how they live, and then reflect that I disdain the second best box at the theatre, and even the simplest of my garments has to be running over with lace and satin bows, I feel as if I were a criminal. I keep saying, why do you deserve to be the one blessed by the fairy godmother? For Cousin Emma, I went and found a nice, pretty, fresh, new little house with more rooms for lodgers. I took it and I paid the rent, the gas and the taxes for 1 year in advance. I made it prettier, fancy even. And then I received the saddest letter from the Duke, who has lost everything. He's had to give up his home, his business, his property. He cannot afford to pay the interest. He told me I should be paid back either during his life or death. It does seem a hideously cruel thing to lose $23,000. It is the most wondrous thing in life to be a giver. The beggar girl was still huddled up in the corner of the step. She looked frightful in her wet and dirty rags. She was staring straight before her with a look of suffering. And Sarah saw her suddenly draw the back of her roughened black hand across her eyes to rub away the tears. She was muttering to herself. Sarah opened the paper bag and took out one of the hot buns, which had already warmed her own cold hands a little. "See," she said, putting the bun in the ragged lap. "This is nice and hot. Eat it, and you will not feel so hungry." The child started and stared up at her as if such sudden, amazing good luck almost frightened her. And then she snatched up the bun and began to cram it into her mouth with great wolfish bites. "Oh my, oh my," Sarah heard her say hoarsely and wildly like, "Oh my." At that moment, the baker woman looked out of her shop window. "Well, I never," she exclaimed. "If that young un hasn't given her buns to a beggar child. Wasn't because she didn't want them either. Well, she looked hungry enough. I'd give something to know what she did it for." For years, the greatest part of my strength has been given over to a certain game of bluff. The bluff was to convince the world I was not an unrelieved boor who was ill most of the time. Sometimes I carry it off, but not always. I do want to be left alone by pain. I'm so tired. My arm and hands tremble as I write, and every nerve in my body seems unstrung. I see weariness in my face when I look in the glass, and my eyes are bloodshot and heavy. My life has been a heavy burden to me, a burden of work, and uncertainty. To half my life, I've been building up with medicines to the point where I could begin to force myself on again through sheer, furious iron and steel willpower. I must work. It costs too much to live. There have been times when I've been working like a slave when I ought to have been resting. I have earned a good deal, but it takes all barely to live. Oh, still, I have had literary lions roaring in the drawing room. Oscar Wilde, George Meredith, Rider Haggard, Henry James. Oh, and I received this. The undermentioned men and women of letters desire to express to Mrs. Frances Hodgson Burnett their appreciation of the great service they believe she has rendered to the unsatisfactory condition of copyright law in England. So quiet and sweet here, so like early June. Roses are everywhere. Great heaven! I have not told you yet. I have a granddaughter, which seems to have been born by magic. So quietly and beautifully it appeared, and so wonderfully radiant is its lovely mother. She is a pet. I now have the relationship of fairy grandmother. Fairy godmother will pale by comparison. I am Nanda, you know. My den is a nursery, and the closet in the corner has a family of dolls of assorted sizes. I invented and dressed them. There's the poppies and the larkspurs. And my doll's house has a writing desk with a telephone on it, a vacuum cleaner, a carpet sweeper, footman in livery, perfectly good grandpapa, grandmama, litter of kittens, and a collie dog. What I believe about the fairies is that they know things, and the dolls, they know things that they will not tell us about. Lovely Manhasset Bay, smiling at the foot of the lawn, and we shall go in the scented evenings down the white stone steps, down the rose bank to the curving beach. The roses I got here are doing beautifully, and the herbaceous beds with their white phlox, rhododendron, azalea, and nasturtium seed. Also, lobelia and white candy tuft bordering the fountain. One of the strange things about living in the world is that it's only now and then one is quite sure one is going to live forever and forever and ever. One knows it sometimes when one's get up at the tender solemn dawn time and goes out and stands alone and throws one's head far back and looks up and watches the pale sky slowly changing and flushing and marvelous unknown things happening until the east almost makes one cry out and one's heart stands still at the strange, unchanging majesty of the rising sun, which has been happening every morning for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. One knows it then for a moment or so. And one knows it at sunset by when one stands by oneself in a wood and the mysterious deep gold stillness slanting through and under the branches seems to be saying slowly, again and again, something one cannot quite hear, no matter how hard one tries. Then sometimes the immense quiet of the dark blue at night, with millions of stars waiting and watching, makes one sure. And sometimes the sound of far-off music makes it true. And sometimes a look in someone's eyes. On my last visit to Maytham, it had been snowing, even in Kent, and the park and the gardens were white. I threw on my red garden cloak and went down the flag terrace, the long walk, through the walled garden, to the beloved place. I think it has been left alone so long that it has grown all into a lovely tangle. I think the roses have climbed and climbed and climbed till they hang from the branches and walls and creep over the ground, almost like a strange grey mist. Some of them have died, but many are alive. And when the summer comes, there will be curtains and fountains of roses. I think the ground is full of daffodils and snowdrops and lilies and iris working their way out of the dark. Now that spring has begun, perhaps they are coming up through the grass. Perhaps there are clusters of purple crocuses and gold ones even now. Perhaps the leaves are beginning to break out and uncurl. And perhaps the grey is changing and the green gauze veil is creeping and creeping over everything. And the birds are coming to look at it because it's so safe and still. And perhaps, the robin has found a mate and is building a nest. As long as one has a garden, one has a future. And if one has a future, one is alive. A merry leaf in one's pocket will make everybody happy and everything go well. With the best I have in me, I have tried to write more happiness into the world. I just want to say thank you all, my dear children, for coming to the party.